you look at the former distribution of other fossil red pandas,
Mm-hmm.
they were once found throughout the northern hemisphere, and they're typically found associated with temperate forests.
Temperate forests. So sort of like what we have here today.
Very much like what we have here today, and I think that's probably part of the reason why the Knoxville Zoo has such good success in breeding red pandas. Is that this really is kind of their ideal environment. It's just that in reality, it's not that we can get the hardcore detail that we can with some other animals, but we can get a general idea.
Right. Okay. And obviously that animal's extinct. We really don't know that much about the animals. We don't really know when it became extinct.
Sure, and that's one of the things that's kind of interesting is people ask me, well, how does this relate to conservation of, say, the living red panda? And the question that I always like to ask is not so much as why are red pandas doing so poorly today, but why did they do so well in the past? I mean, they're found in Europe, they're found in Asia, they're found in North America. They're once basically, throughout the northern hemisphere. And so what was so perfect then that's missing now?
But they're, although found quite a bit over in, say, Eurasia, how many sites do we have here in North America that have them? I mean, we have it here.
Yeah, we have 2 sites in North America. There's a single tooth has been found from the Ringgold Formation of Washington. And then, of course, we're finding nice articulated skeletons here. And unfortunately, I shouldn't say unfortunately, it's a good problem to have, but our site is producing the best material out there. Most specimens are just isolated teeth, maybe a piece of a jaw, but we're actually finding articulated skeletons here.
So from that, maybe we can really reconstruct its habitat, or at least how it's living on the ground.
Sure, and we can start looking at its behavior. And I have students now that are actually working on projects trying to look at the morphology of the skeleton and say, was it doing the same thing as living red pandas or something different? And it appears to be doing something different.
So the red panda today is more up in the trees, right?
It's an arboreal animal, and it's really sort of an end member of a long lineage, and it's a very unusual end member. And so again, it gives us this false impression of what all of these animals were doing.
All the pandas should have been, yeah. Well, that's really different than what your bison is. I mean, you work with bison, and in fact, you and your parents have a bison ranch, right, in Wisconsin. But when you talk about the Pleistocene, so the Ice Age, say, 20,000 years ago, they talk about an extinct form of bison. And yet, we have bison today, such as on your ranch. At what point does bison become extinct? And then when did we get our current bison? What's going on with the species of bison?
There's been multiple species of bison in the past. If we take 20,000 years ago, there's probably between 2 and 3 quote-unquote species, whatever you want to call species. Vertebrate paleontology, we try and do what's different enough to call it a species. And for bison, it's only based on horn cores, just the horn spread itself. Anything from the skull back, it's really hard to tell. That's what I'm investigating right now. Yeah, precisely. Okay. And so 20,000 years ago, trying to lead into what we have today's animals, there's been a couple different papers out, other people working on it, saying that it's potentially the same species, group of animal that are just adapting to the climate change and getting smaller through time.
So today's bison is the smallest, basically,
it is the smallest
of that whole lineage. Okay. Can we really get environment from bison? I mean, from the panda, we obviously have an idea that there was trees, there was some sort of temperate forest, maybe subtropical. What do we get from bison other than good steaks?
And burgers, too.
And burgers, yeah.
We can get an idea of what the environment of what it'd be living in, but we can't get it perfect because the animal's so large, and at that time there weren't fences in the way, so it just migrates wherever it wants to go, and it can go days without food and water if it has to. So it's really hard to pinpoint the actual type of environment that it's living in, but there should be at least some sort of sustainable grassland, or enough grass for it to feed on, and there's bison record in Florida, southern Florida, all the way up to Alaska, and then going all the way down into Nicaragua, from California over to as far east as just about New England.
So really, bison isn't extinct.
No.
But the larger one of the Ice Age is gone. That form is gone. And then we have the one today, which is smaller. So it's a continuum of size change.
Yeah.
Okay. And of course, we don't have bison here at the Great Fossil Site.
Yet.
Yeah, better not. Yeah, mainly
It's too
because
old.
the bison didn't arrive from Asia until, let's say, on the oldest might be 300,000 years ago. And of course, this site's dating, 4.5, 7 million years ago. So nobody knew bison steaks.
We need to find that first record, though.
Yeah, that would do it. Definitely.
Did the bison come the same way that man and the other mammals?
Yeah.
came?
Across Beringia.
Yeah, cross Beringia. So, and when you think about it, because today, if we were to, quote, walk up to that part of Alaska, we'd obviously get to the coastal edge and go, well, there's water here. How do we get over to Siberia? Well, with a lower sea level, there's 1,000 kilometers north to south as a bridge that would connect Alaska, if you will,
Yeah.
to Siberia. So there was a really good land bridge.
Well, and
Then the people would have come in boats.
Yes, so
they could have come earlier, yes.
Yeah.
But I mean, to continue on what you were saying, I was actually even going to mention too. What's neat is we have good records that there were probably some low stands during the Miocene as well, and so our pandas probably
low stands of the ocean.
Yes, low stands of the ocean. So our pandas probably came across the same route. And what's neat is in certain parts of southern Alaska, there actually are good botanical records of sort of this temperate forest, this cool temperate forest. And so I mean, there probably was this nice corridor that those animals could actually pass through. And it's just, to me, it's neat that we have successive generations of different types of animals crossing that same bridge.
But they can go both ways. I mean, when you think about it, when you look at where the alligator occurs today, we know it's essentially the southeast, okay? But there is a Chinese alligator, and it's native there. Native, so to speak. And it's very closely related to what we have. And all the fossil record is essentially indicating is that it too crossed that Beringian time when it was obviously much warmer up there. There's no indication that the alligator could swim across the ocean the way certain crocodiles do, because alligators can't process salt the way that crocodiles can. So alligators don't have that gland. So we know that they couldn't have, swum out to Hawaii, on over to Japan, and then into China. They couldn't do that. So they too had to cross Beringia. We don't know if it's really the same time as the red panda, but there must have been a migration going both ways, probably over millions of years that would have happened. One of the things that we're trying to use here at the Great Fossil Site, but at other sites, different ages, is when we do have a particular animal, will it help us reconstruct not just information about the animal, but also what was the habitat like? So we kind of indicated trees for the red panda. And then what's the climate like, which is harder to reconstruct. The fact that we have an alligator here is really helping us out a lot. Alligators are probably, of all the crocodilians, are probably the most, they're the least sensitive to cold. We know that they occur further north than any of the other crocodilians. They can actually occur in water where the surface will freeze over. And when the surface freezes over, you'll notice that their nostrils are just sticking out of the ice. So they can keep breathing, but they don't quite freeze. I'm sure they're cold as the dickens. I certainly would be. But they're able to do that. The one problem is, though, although they can exist, is if there's too much freezing, they can't reproduce and have a viable population. So just because you have an alligator skeleton doesn't mean it was the ideal climate. It could have been the one alligator that went north and died, like this is no good, okay? But the fact we have multiple ages of alligators in our collection, some that you have found, Wayne, and such, that they show that we have a good population here. Well, that's telling us then that this environment had to be pretty close to about 70 degrees all year long, not just the average, but all year long. So that's really kind of helping us reconstruct climate and then somewhat habitat. Now do you have a question?
Yeah, the alligators we have here, compared to the modern ones, smaller?
I don't think it's really that much smaller.
I mean, we haven't got any really, really big ones. You know, we haven't got
what I've
anything
seen.
that's.
Most of the stuff I've seen are like this size.
Well,
know,
there's that one
especially the
complete one,
teeth.
right.
Yeah, well, the teeth I've been finding lately, they're really small.
Yeah, I suspect it's probably just slightly smaller, but I don't think that's really that big of a deal.
We just aren't seeing the big ones yet.
We need to find another 40 or so of those.
Yeah,
and that
before
would
we
be-
have a good
Yeah.
sample. But I mean, like Jim was saying, it is nice that we are getting some really, really young individuals suggesting
Yeah.
that they were actually breeding
I mean,
here.
Right.
Lately, I've come across some very, very tiny teeth.
Well, think of the Chinese alligator. It's not that big either. I mean, they can
That would
occasionally
be
get big.
smaller
but,
than this table.
Yeah.
The living Chinese alligator.
Oh.
So they are a small alligator, yeah. Another way we can play some games with the local environment and climate, you may recall that we found the beaded lizard, Gila Derma. And today that animal occurs as far north as Las Vegas, Nevada, about as far east as, say, not quite the New Mexico-Arizona border, it's still west of that, and then right on down to Guatemala, okay? So although when you see it in Arizona, you think, oh, it's a desert animal, do we have desert at gray? Well, actually, you find most of the animals, the diversity and such, occurring down in Guatemala in a subtropical to tropical forest, which is really no different than what we're talking about from other data that was probably here at Gray Fossil Site. Now, if the two animals, the one today with its constraints, it's easy to say, why doesn't it occur elsewhere? Because we can look at it climatically and say, it can't withstand this, and these parameters. We take that and apply that right to the Gray Fossil Site beaded lizard. Well, then it's again telling us this place had to have a temperature always at 70 degrees or higher. It could not be below that because they are not viable. So again, we're seeing a couple things that are telling us this was kind of a warm place. May have still had gray skies, but it was definitely a warm place to live in.
Well, I think one way to look at it is think of like northern Florida. You know, the average temperature in northern Florida is pretty warm. You're still going to get snow from time to time. You're still going to have things happen, but it's just warm enough that you get
Right.
things like alligators, you know, having viable populations. And I think that's the other key too is to jump back for a second, is that we're really trying to look at all the animals and plants together. Every one of them tells a little bit of the puzzle, but as you piece it all together, you start recognizing, okay, here's another forest animal, here's another forest animal, here's another warm animal. And so, you know, we start seeing all these things pointing in the same direction, and it starts really adding up after a while. But we do have to be careful, though, sometimes, too, because, you know, we do have to recognize that we're dealing with extinct taxa. So the requirements may not be exactly the same, but we can at least use it as a good proxy. I mean, you have to have a starting point. When people ask me about tapirs and where are tapirs found today, most people think of tropics. But you also have to remember that even during the Pleistocene, they were common throughout North America and Europe even. So, I mean, you know, and that was during the Ice Age. And even, you know, on top of that, of the 4 living species of tapir, Tapirus pinchaque, the woolly mountain tapir, lives up in high elevations and actually has thick fur, like a teddy bear. I mean, it actually lives in cool environments. So they, even though you think of them as a tropical animal, they can tolerate cold.
So then it kind of says, well then, okay, so we have the tapir we have here is an extinct form. That's what you guys are
It's a
saying.
dwarf
it's
tapir.
Polkensis. And we have an extinct form of bear, and we have an extinct form of your red panda. What is causing extinctions? And I'd like to know from you people in the audience, why do you think extinctions are occurring? What do you think?
I think people have a lot to do with it.
But these things died off
Yeah, these things
before
are-
people. So
Well-
we can't blame us this time.
We could-
Well, we could, we still can, it's just, yeah.
I
Change.
suppose, yeah,
Changing the climate.
Change,
Ecology.
climate change, okay,
And, yeah, it changes the ecology, you know, what they feed on.
okay.
You know, may not be able to withstand if it's cold
Okay,
or
so-
it gets too hot.
So you're saying that climate may be directly,
I would think
or
so.
it could be climate changing a
And-
food source, and then that food source not here, so it's indirect. What do
Yeah.
you think?
Well, I like that idea,
Mhm.
the climate change, but directly sometimes droughts.
Sure, drought going the other direction.
Yeah.
Sure, drought.
Sure, small scale features.
What's your
changing in the foodstuff sources
Okay.
get it, which is probably directly related to climate.
Sure. So what we're really kind of saying, and we're all kind of agreeing, is that it's a complex thing. And then when people arrive, and let's say people arrived here for sake of argument, say 15,000 years ago, whatever. Whenever people arrive, the implication is that it may have caused some extinctions. There's no, it's hard to play that game a little bit. But, your bison, Ice Age bison, if it really became extinct, maybe people did it, but it still occurs. So really, people didn't really wipe out the bison per se. They may have helped reduce the size or something.
And there's definitely, at least from what I've seen in the records, is there's been 2 close to extinction events for bison. Right after the Ice Age, the climate changes, they're, well, I can't eat that, I better go over here, and some of their relatives are leaving behind. So they do, some of them change, and they have a bottleneck in number of animals. And then again, so that was climate. And then again, in the 1800s, late 1800s, our army was sent out and getting rid of the bison so we could have a railway to go out west.
Yeah.
So we don't knock trains off the rails, and other reasons. So
So clearly, people were an issue, as you were saying, with the bison at that time. But how do you think we get at a climatic cause for extinctions? What are you going to look for? How are you going to determine this?
Well, I have one question.
Sure,
Did
question.
all the species die at one time that have been found here?
No, I don't think so.
Now, maybe rephrase that. When you say die at one time, do you mean go extinct or?
Well, let's go first of all, die at one time,
Okay.
then go extinct.
Well, I think the thing to look at is when you find what are true natural traps, fossil sites that are accumulations based on a natural trap, they're typically very, very high in carnivores because the carnivores are attracted to the struggling prey. And actually, I worked on a series of sites in Spain that were like this. They were small little bell-shaped, basically sinkhole collapses that served as traps, and they're just stacked full of carnivores. Well, we don't get that here at Gray. The carnivores are really, really rare. And when you look at the sheer size of Gray and the fact that it was basically a pond or lake that filled in with sediment, how long does it take a lake to completely fill in with sediment? 10,000 years, 15,000 years? Now imagine just a single animal dying every year for 10 or 15,000 years. It doesn't take long to get a lot of animals. And so I think what you're really looking at is more of an attritional setting. Just the day-to-day activities around a watering hole, animals are going to naturally die. And tapirs in particular, you wonder why do we have so many of those? Well, they love water. That's one of their main requirements is water. They eat in water, they poop in water, they do everything in water. And so if this was the only lake for how many miles around, they were living here. And so when you really look at what our most common animals are, they're all the things that were living in the lake. The tapirs, of course, but also turtles, alligators, fish, salamanders. Those are really our common things. Most of our other mammals are only known from a few bits and pieces. But to come back to your other question about did they all go extinct at the same time, some of the species that we have here did go out at the end of the Hempylian. They did go out 4.5 million years, but a handful of them do go on past it. Our horse, for sake of argument, has been found at sites as young as 2 million years old. So, we do know that some of the animals did continue on.
So they didn't all kind of go, okay, on the count of 5,
We're
let's
all gonna go
all
extinct.
become
There
extinct.
wasn't an extinction event at that, anywhere right in that time frame. There's just
No.
background extinctions of things going out, but nothing big happening.
So you can imagine then as climate is changing, and who knows how fast that may have happened, but as climate changes, for some species, the change is just too much. They can't adapt, as you were saying, they can't decide to move over here to get its food source, so they do become extinct. Or maybe they can't reproduce. Let's say it's a form of animal where cold or too much heat is a real factor for reproduction. So you can imagine that it's happening a little bit for this group, but everybody else saying, not a problem. And then as more change occurs, or more drastic change occurs, then some of them may too fall out. We're certainly seeing that today, right? We're certainly seeing issues today. And getting back to your point about humans, clearly we've seen a lot of things happening when people arrive. When people arrive on islands like the Pacific, we know that within 10 or 20 years, many of the species of birds die out. There's a small crocodile found, and it's fairly common on some of the islands in the South Pacific, Fiji, from there on over to New Guinea. As soon as the early Polynesians show up, within 10 to 50 years, no more alligators, no more of that crocodilian, essentially, in that area. So clearly people do have an effect, but maybe not always. And it could be that climate was affecting it either directly or the food source, as you were saying, and they're kind of on the edge. They're like, I can hold my own, and then people show up, and that's it. That provides the nick point of extinction in that particular case.
What about siltation?
What about what?
Siltation.
In what way?
Well, just silt and dirt coming in during like a rain event.
You could have that if it's essentially a flooding event or such that is changing the environment. If there's too much rain and too much erosion, you could either erode away the plants that you eat if you only eat what's in the valley bottoms. But Blaine, go ahead.
I was just going to say, to come back to the bird example, what's really interesting too is that we're finding out more and more that the interactions with people do vary too, depending on the types of people that are moving in. And before we went to Hawaii recently, I actually did a little research on the birds. I was curious about the birds of Hawaii and what might have gone extinct. And I started reading up, and what I found, mostly Stedman's work, was that actually when the Polynesians first colonized the Pacific, that they approximate there were 2,000 species of bird that went extinct throughout the islands because there were so many endemic birds to a variety of different islands. But what's interesting is they were mainly the large forms and the ground nesting birds that were hit the hardest.
The flightless rails.
Things that they wanted they wanted to eat.
Things you could walk up and just hit over the
Sure.
head.
Yeah.
But also the frugivores, those eating fruit, and the granivores. And what's interesting is when the Europeans came in, then there was a secondary extinction event. And it was a whole different group. It was mainly nectivorous birds and insectivorous birds because the Europeans were clearing away the forest. And so it was like two separate events and very distinctive in its actual impact. The other thing, too, that I wanted to mention is that they can complicate trying to tease out the climate. And I thought of it when you brought up humans, is that you need to think about any interactions. Interactions with other animals. And a question that I'm often asked is why is our panda extinct? Why did the pandas do so well and then disappear? And climate's probably part of it, but it could also just be competition. When procyonids, the raccoons, essentially start becoming successful in North America, living a very similar lifestyle, because we feel that our red panda was basically an omnivore. So it may have been direct competition. The raccoon may have just been better at filling that little niche.
Raccoons, are they from here? Or did they migrate in, or
kind of back and forth? Because procyonids, in general, there is a good record in North America, but true raccoons, as we see them, were probably a South American immigrant that came up from South America. But we do know that land bridge, even though traditionally you'll say 3 million or plus or minus is when the main flow took place back and forth between North and South America, we know there had to be at least some contact earlier because we get giant ground sloths.
So what,
as old as 8 or 9 million years,
9.
you get giant ground sloths. Even here at Gray, we have a giant ground sloth. So clearly, there were some animals that were able to make it across sooner.
Right, because that land bridge was kind of developing, right? It had an island arc, so there's plots of land here and there.
Yeah.
And then
so what probably happened to get back to the panda is that, when that bridge finally linked up and raccoons came up into North America, they probably outcompeted our red pandas. And so they went extinct. But it's so hard to answer, though, only having two localities. And I said there was a Washington specimen. I know. Yeah, I know. I said if there was a Washington specimen in ours, they're actually two different species too. So I mean, it's hard for us to really get into the detail when we only have 2 data points.
Wayne, you have a question.
Well, yeah, on the raccoon, do we expect to find any of the
I do expect to find a procyanid of some kind here.
Of some kind.
And in fact, we do have a jaw that looks like it's a procyanid. Unfortunately, it only has one tooth in it, and it's worn flat as a pancake. So, and it's a fragment of a jaw. So I can say yes, it is a raccoon relative.
But it doesn't look like a raccoon.
It's not a raccoon,
though. The panda, or smaller, or
it's about the size of the panda. The teeth are smaller, but as Jim just pointed out, it won't be a true raccoon. It'll be a relative, and it'll be a quaddy-like animal or something.
Quite a money. when we look at extinctions, then Wayne, you've dealt with extinctions, Ice Age.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and we're bringing up the fact that people could have done it, and plants may have disappeared, the food source is gone, or it may have been directly with climate. What have you been dealing with Ice Age?
For Ice Age extinctions in North and South America.
Because you have a big project going on in Argentina.
And one of the things to think about, though, when we compare South America, first of all, they have the highest number of taxa that went extinct.
Okay.
All right, but then we also have to look at the fact that most of their taxonomy is not very well understood. So
Okay.
how correct is that actually?
Okay.
Um,
Maybe it's
and so
inflated.
that was one of the
you
big
know.
discussions we had at one of these recent meetings, is
Mhm.
that it is overinflated.
Okay.
So when one of my colleagues recently worked on the bears there, he took, they thought they had 17 species of giant short-faced bear. That's what was
Wow.
in the literature. And then as he studied the Pleistocene ones, he got it down to 4. I think it's probably 3 at most. Hope
Okay.
he's not watching this.
He's not out there.
But it is. It's a taxonomy aspect as well. And so as we were talking about the taxonomic list, there were people in the group saying, oh, actually, we can knock that one out. We can knock that one out. But I think regardless, you're still talking about more species going extinct in South America than went extinct up here. The problem I have anytime we start saying what was the cause is that we can't say what is the cause when we know that both humans and climate are interacting at the same time. The question is, which happened first? What is more extreme? And did the combination of multiple factors actually develop the extinction or cause the extinction? So the first thing we have to understand is the timing. What is the real timing of when the different taxa go out? And that's why we have a couple of projects that are funded for lots and lots of radiocarbon dates right now, is to get a better handle on what species in North America and what species in South America actually lasted up to the very end of the Ice Age. And what we're finding is that many of them didn't make it all the way up to the end, even here in North America.
Mm-hmm.
And that some of them lasted longer than we thought they did. Mammoths and mastodons, which were once thought to be the keystone species here in North America, meaning that if you kill them off, it's going to have a domino effect and kill a lot of the other ones. We're finding the opposite. They're actually the ones that seem to have lasted the longest. They're the ones that are coming back with 10,000 year, 9,000 year
Well,
dates.
and even on that island off of Alaska,
Right.
3,000.
Yeah, but I think that what most people who are studying this now are saying is, well, it's climate and humans, and there's an interaction there, and we don't know quite what that interaction is yet, and what was more severe.
So do you think by studying then, if we can study ice age extinctions and some of the material you're working on out in the West, and even looking here at Greg, if we understand extinctions better, is that going to help us maybe understand how extinctions could be occurring now? I mean,
Yeah, so it helps us understand extinctions occurring now, but I think even more importantly, too, is what impact did it have on the animals that are still alive today? So that we can look at, for example, your bison or your voles. You know, what was the impact on them, and how much did they have to change their distribution to be happy again?
See, I like working on reptiles because they didn't die out.
They didn't die
So
out.
they just kind of
But-
go, you mammals can do whatever you want to, we're sticking around.
Yeah, but there's a lot of problems with reptiles.
There are a
You
lot
can't
of problems.
identify them to
And
nearly
they
a
don't taste
specific
as good
level.
as his bison.
Yeah, that's what it is.
You know, it's you can't. You know, you can't take that fossil and say this is what species it was
Right.
so easily,
Right.
and that's what makes it more difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the thing to think of or keep in mind too is that a lot of times when you have these major extinction events like the Pleistocene extinction, a friend of mine once put it this way. He said it's not the single punch that gets you; it's the combination. And I
Yeah.
think in a lot of cases with adding humans to the mix, you know, if you have climate change, you have things going on, these animals are trying to react, and then you throw humans in on top of it, it's just too much.
Well, I
It's that
think
final
Yeah.
push.
you know, as we look at the geologic record and we look at the big 5 earlier extinctions, and we start saying, okay, and you hear it all over the news, or not the news, but you hear it all over the documentaries. It was the massive meteorite that hit the Earth that
Yeah.
killed the dinosaurs. Well, if you're a geologist or a paleontologist and you actually start looking into the details, there are a lot of other things going on at that exact same time or around that exact same time that could have been a contributing factor as well. You know, massive amounts of basalt flows, you know, that are going to change the atmosphere.
Well, think about
And so-
Denver area. Think
Yeah.
about mid-continent. We lost a lot of essentially marine reptiles, in mid-continent. Well, why? It wasn't because of the asteroid. It's because the shallow sea that we had
Right, and so
retreated.
it's
So-
multiple things. It's a synergistic effect, I think, that causes mass extinctions, and it's figuring out what are the different components, and understanding what are all those different possible components that help you better understand what could cause a mass extinction.
And I think we don't understand the dominoes effect that we were talking about, that
Sure.
you just mentioned, because we can get rid of one thing or save one thing, and it has deleterious effects on some other taxon. So,
What effect does plate tectonics have in this?
It's huge, right?
That's
It's
what-
huge.
yeah. Could that be because the inland sea to go out because of plate action to where it?
But that's gonna be slow, you're right.
The land mass rose somewhat, and
but that's going to be very slow, right? It's not like, whoa, did you feel that? And all of a sudden,
Well,
we're,
yeah, of course.
So it's going to be very slow, but the point's well taken. But to make it more complex would be, as it's rising very, very slowly, what if we go through a glacial period and we lower the sea level at the same time? Because we're getting more glacial mass.
Yeah.
So we've made it more complex that way.
Yeah.
But
Well,
clearly,
a lot of our big extinction records are of the marine fauna, the invertebrates, and they completely disappear because their habitat completely disappears.
yeah, of course.
Which is going to be related to plate tectonics. As
Yeah.
things move around, I mean, the classic example I like to give my students in class is, if you dig around the bedrock in Iowa, it's all beautiful coral reefs. It's all limestone because at the time that it was deposited, it was sitting at the equator, and it was underwater. Whereas now, needless to say, it's not a friendly environment for corals now.
You do have trouble trying to convince people that the Himalayas was caused by plate tectonics,
Yeah,
Buckling.
but it's a really easy thing to show geologically.
Yes.
The
Yes, it
migration
is,
of
but
India
well,
northward.
Trying to get that
north-
through somebody's, in somebody's mind.
Yeah.
27,000 feet,
Sure, but the nice thing about it today, though, is with GPS, we can actually tell you what speed India is still moving.
Yeah.
It is
Oh,
still
yeah, it's still
slamming
moving,
into
still
Asia.
building.
It's
Yeah,
still
right,
building, and it's
right.
neat that you can actually document that now. When I was in school, we couldn't do that. We couldn't say, oh, it's moving at this rate per year, but now we have satellites. We can say, oh, it's moving 3 centimeters a year or whatever, and we can actually measure it, which is really neat.
So let's take a look at today's climate change, and we don't need to get into the fact who's to blame. Let's just say climate is changing. Now, some people would say, well, climate's really not changing. I think it's pretty evident, at least the data I'm reading, that it is. When you look at Alaskan glaciers, and when you find that of the 85 major glaciers, 80 of them have reduced. And of those 80, I think it's 5 have totally disappeared, and 4 are actually increasing. So there's little idiosyncrasies there, but the overall trend is certainly saying it's a bad time if you are a glacier. And so then, how is that going to affect us? Well, here in Tennessee, it may affect us in ways that we won't see right away, but if you live on the beach someplace,
Yeah.
well, you're going to have a rough time. One of the things I do with my students in my geology class is say, pick any city you want to around the world, and then find a topographic map, or get elevations, and draw a line that's about, say, 5 or 6 feet, couple meters elevation above sea level. Draw that around the city, wherever you can find it, and then color in what's now going to be the new underwater sea level. And it's amazing to those students how much of Los Angeles, London, Miami, that's okay.
Manhattan.
Manhattan.
I say New York,
Yeah, all our major cities. And it's really no different than what other animals, when you said, well, I can't eat here, so I'll go over there. Well, people are going to have to do that, right? We're going to have to move our cities. We can probably still live with our diet. Maybe we should change our diet. But clearly we're going to have to move where we live.
For laymen on the glaciers disappearing, there is a book out. This photographer, over several years, has been photographing glaciers, and he has 20 years ago or whatever when he started, and today, from the same
Isn't that phenomenal?
point, as close as he could get to it. Oh, it just blows your mind.
And those are glaciers around the world, not just
Yeah,
Bison.
yeah, oh yeah,
right.
this
All
was
over
around the world, yeah. He did this around the world.
Interesting thing with his camera, if you look at those pictures, he's showing you X number of years ago, actually not too many years ago.
No. Like
Here's the
20
calving
most.
entrance. And then after about 6 months, he had to move the camera because it kept retreating so much.
So
it was
much.
going out of its field of view.
Yes. Uh-huh.
And when you do that to so many ones worldwide, something is happening. We can blame whoever we want to, you know. But the fact is, there is some change going
Yes.
on. So what do you think are going to be the animals that are going to be affected, besides us?
Well, I don't know.
We're supposed to know.
Well, I mean, the animals are going to follow their habitats, species by species. Is my answer, I guess, is that species don't necessarily react in groups; they react individually based on what they like.
Okay.
So that means that what we perceive as an ecosystem today is not what it's going to be like in the future. And we get really good examples of this from the Pleistocene to today, and it's called a non-analog fauna. And some of the sites that you guys worked at were some of the first that were really representative in showing that. But we're going to see new analogs, I guess, that are developed as these animals move based on their own species tolerance levels, and some of them are going to go extinct. And it means that people that are land managers are also going to have to stop thinking about how do I keep it the way it is, because the animals that I actually preserve in my little area might not want to live here anymore.
Right.
So they're going to have to take the past into account.
Along that same line is, well, wait a minute, this is our city. We don't want coyotes or whatever the animal is in here. We're going to have to make corridors, is what you're really saying.
That's true, too.
If we have a city and then a habitat that's, quote, preserved, that habitat's going to have to change or become flooded.
That's a really good point, because one of the things that animals can't do often now is move.
Right.
Because they don't
We
have
restrict
those
them.
corridors anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to say,
And gene flow is really restricted.
yeah, a classic example is, the jaguar has been trying to reestablish itself back into the United States. Well, it doesn't understand the Mexican border. It doesn't understand that there's, that there's barriers there, but it's trying. It's trying to get across. And they have actually documented that there are some individuals that have moved into the United States and actually are living here. I mean, they've photographed males scent marking, so they actually are trying to establish territories. But that's always going to be a challenge to them, is to go back and forth, have to cross that border.
Highways.
Walls,
Highways,
fences. I mean, that's going to be difficult.
Yeah.
What about the Great Lakes? How will they be affected as sea level increases?
That's going to be an interesting challenge for the Great Lakes, because right now they have the locks between the lakes because they're at different levels to begin with.
Yeah.
Well, as sea level rises, that's going to become a real challenge for them, is to actually try to maintain that waterway. But I suspect that quite a bit of that is actually going to get flooded, because if you look at if you get online, they have some really neat maps, the what if type maps, and one of them is what if all the glacial ice that we have, the ice caps, everything melts, and it's estimated that the sea level could go up 200 feet. Which is crazy. So think about how do you react to that?
Yeah, I mean,
Learn to swim.
Well, what's really neat is those maps. They show North America, and Florida's gone. It doesn't even exist anymore. I mean, the entire southeast coast just migrates well inland. It's really interesting to look at those maps.
I mean, from a paleontological perspective, it's going the wrong way. I want it to go the other way. Because right now what we're doing, as we increase sea level, as it rises, we're creating fossil sites. We're creating depositional sites. I want the sea level to retreat some, because there's a lot of really cool Pleistocene sites
just right
that
off
would
the
become
coast.
exposed with
Yeah.
a little bit of sea level lower.
What's happening in the Colorado River, though, as they draw more water out, it's dropping in level,
that's
so
true.
you could go down there.
That's a good point. We'll just all go out to the southwest.
There you go.
Okay.
I could be drier. So.
And if we go far enough, then we can start working on Antarctica. So that actually
Yeah,
would be good.
finally we could work on Antarctica.
true.
That's a good point.
We have some new records there. So they'll be dinosaurs.
Start working on monotremes from there.
Yeah.
Well, are there other questions from folks in the audience? Jay, what's your
Hey, Jay.
feeling about humans and extinctions?
The impact of climate change on humans.
Well, first of all, I'll say I'm with Blaine. I want the sea levels to go the other way.
Come up here, Jay.
I think that's where a lot of some of the earliest human sites in North America
Are gonna be off the
located,
coast.
and I know there's some folks working on it. So,
What do you think they're going along the coast? Are they taking their little kayaks or whatever and coming down
I
the
think
coast?
I think people got here from any number of of routes, but I think at some point, whether you're talking about the Pacific or the Atlantic coast, yeah, it involved people moving along the coastlines that aren't coastlines now, but were at one time. And I think if we had better access or better
We
excavation,
could just drain a little bit.
yeah. And some people, Dennis
Like the
Stanford
Pacific.
and Bruce Bradley, are working on that. I think they're working on doing some very ancient materials have been found in Chesapeake Bay, and I know they're supposedly we're going to be out in the field maybe this coming summer, I guess. So that should be interesting to see what they.
But
come
if we
up with.
cover up Manhattan, we are creating a pretty cool archaeological site.
Yeah, you can see. Yeah.
Million years from now, somebody will be like, wow, look at this treasure trove.
So, when you talk about coming down the coast, let's take the western coast, because with a lower sea level, it doesn't expand that much further out into the ocean, as we would say now. Do you think the Channel Islands off of California, off of Monterey area, do you think the purported human remains and the archaeology found there with mammoth, do you think that's are those good associations? Because they're dating about, what, 10,000, 11,000, right?
Yeah, I know. I'm not terribly familiar with those sites, so I'll have to
Okay.
plead with a certain amount of ignorance there. But I know Jim Dixon, who I think is at Colorado, has done some work looking at some of the rivers on the west coast that drain into the Pacific, and that our assumption is that there was glaciation all the way to the ocean. And I think what they're finding out is there were some of these major waterways that weren't, and they've been investigating those. There's paleontological records.
So they can kind of leapfrog, if you will?
They could kind of bounce around the coast, and they could make a living both hunting and foraging in some of these bigger streams that emptied into the Pacific that were not completely glaciated.
Quote, dry valley
Right.
sort of thing. Okay. Well, obviously we have a lot more to learn.
You know, there were some fish that were in Colorado that the Native Americans used.
Mm-hmm.
And then when Americans started exploring it a lot more, the fish were still there, but then they've gone extinct.
Yeah,
And
some of the
they sort of reminded me of halibut.
Yeah, there's some chubs and things like that in the Colorado River that have had recent problems because of us humans, because we've dammed up the rivers and created cold water instead of warm water. So there's an effect there. But
To get back to one of the things Jay was mentioning too, is that I knew a guy, Tim Heaton, who did a lot of work up in Alaska, and he was able to show that quite a few of the little coastal islands probably were ice-free, because what he was finding was bear skeletons in the caves and dating them, and he was finding that they were there, throughout a lot of the end of the Pleistocene. And so clearly those islands and at least those caves were accessible to the bears, and so chances are they were ice-free. So it's it's probably not only just along the coast, but even the little islands along the coast.
so
as
maybe
well.
the bears are going, oh, a new diet is arriving.
Yeah, a new diet.
Yeah.
Well, what was I tell you what made me sick though is that Tim showed a picture of one of these bear skeletons, and it was an entire skeleton sprawled out on the floor of this cave, and it looked like it died yesterday. It was a perfect skeleton, and he was getting dates of 30,000, 40,000 years. It was
That's how all those sites are. Up there. And they're really cold though.
Yeah, that's what it is. It's cold.
Cold and wet.
Yeah.
That brings up a good point, though, is that when you find these animals, you need to figure out how old they are directly. And that's, of course, what we're trying to do here at the Gray site. But with the Pleistocene material that you're working with, and Wayne, what you're working with, at least with radiocarbon dating, you can date it directly. And what you're trying to do in South America with that group would be to date each taxon directly. We just can't do that here at Gray because we don't have the dating mechanism to date each red panda, each alligator, each whatever. So it's a different problem. But clearly we have to have better chronology. I'm sure you have that in your cave sites, Jay, when you work with shelters and such. You need to.
He has all kinds of tools he can use.
Yeah.
Well, we're somewhat, although a lot of North American archaeologists are still skeptical, I think it's changing. I've been somewhat fortunate in my own research because several years ago we were getting situations where we were not getting material to radiocarbon date. And so I've, for the last about 7 years, been employing luminescence dating.
Luminescent dating.
Pretty much, mostly on ceramics, but we've had some success with stone tools and hard
How does that
stones.
work? What are you?
It's radiometric, but basically what you're measuring, it's items that have a crystalline structure, but items that have been significantly, or what some people would say catastrophically heated.
Okay.
And you're essentially measuring the time between the last archaeological firing of that hearthstone, cooking of that vessel, maybe manufacturing that vessel, and the time when you light it up in the lab with the luminescence.
So it's a clock. When you heat it up,
Yes.
it clicks it over to 0.
Exactly.
And then there's the stopwatch.
If it's significant enough heat, and so basically, electrons get trapped in impurities in the crystalline lattice, and they build up over time as that material stays cool or it's not significantly heated. And you basically flash it and you release those electrons again and reset the clock.
But I guess that's not really something we could do here at the Gray Fossil Site. But what it really means is we got to know all the different mechanisms for dating, and then pick the one what's going to best
Yeah, we're
work.
really unfortunate here because there are many different kinds of radiometric dating, and unfortunately, most of them are either like radiocarbon for really young things, or they're for really old things, and we're stuck in this sort of no man's
We needed
land.
an ash.
If we had an ash.
We had a volcanic
Yeah.
explosion that would, but we didn't.
But we didn't. Yeah, at least we haven't found one yet.
So, well, are there other questions from the audience or anything?
Well, we should probably wrap it up.
Yeah, we should probably wrap. Well, thank you very much for being here. And if you have more questions a little bit, we'll be around here in the museum.
And Jay's talk is at 1:30.
1:30?
Yep.
Thank you,
Half
Jeff.
hour.
Everybody,
Thank you.
appreciate it.